Hello everybody and welcome back to the second part of the Carl Stanfield episode on the Jack the Lad podcast. Welcome back.
Yeah, good to be back.
Good. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. And in the last episode, obviously, we covered a bit of your trails and stuff like that, a bit of an overview, and your kit changes and stuff like that. I want to get into sort of the nitty gritty of it now, of like your sort of day by day experiences, stuff that stands out within each state if something did, and all that. So yeah, sort of and guide us through with a sort of a map of each day from day one all the way to 351.
Yeah, sure. So started out New Year's Eve of 2021. I flew down to Key West, and I stayed with the roommate of a girl who had hiked one of the trails the previous year, that just found me online and offered if I needed a place to stay. She wanted to help out a hiker. I posted like kind of a blog announcement sort of thing on the backpacking website that I write for. And she just found me and offered a place to stay. So that kind of set the tone for what the year was going to be like, as far as just like meeting up with total strangers and going for it. And so woke up and started hiking with the sunrise in the first of the year. And so the first, I think it's 108 miles to go across the Keys, just walking between bridges and everything to get to the mainland before I got up to southern Florida, kind of near Miami, and then cut across the state and then got to the actual Florida trail. And then so I was on roads for about the first 200 miles before I got to the trail, and then was on like a pretty good trail system that goes through the state of Florida. So walking through kind of some swampy areas, definitely a decent bit wet going through Florida. And that was one of the states or one of the parts of the year really that I was the most intimidated by, just because I'd heard a lot of scary stories about the wildlife that's down there. I mean, you've got alligators that are running around. They have an issue with these giant pythons that have gotten loose and breeded. And so now there are these like 12, 15 foot long snakes that are loose all over the place that people are out hunting. I never saw any of them, but I was definitely a little intimidated kind of hearing about them. And then there's also bears in Florida. There's panthers. And some of the locals told me there's one area where in the 60s they had filmed like a Tarzan movie, and the monkeys got loose and are still thriving in this forest area. So there's an area you can see wild monkeys in Florida. So Florida is crazy. It's as wild as anything that you hear about it anywhere else all over the country. People there were awesome. I stayed with a lot of folks there, but yeah, just going through the wildlife was interesting in Florida, as well as just the trail itself, like walking on flat stuff for the entirety of the day was pretty different, and still took a toll on my body. Like I thought that'd just be easy breezy, but just the repetitive nature of your foot hitting the ground the exact same way every time wore my body out just as much, well, almost as much as anything else did. I won't say that's harder than mountains, but it was harder than I expected it to be. So that was 1,200 miles just to get through Florida. So that was like 15-20% of the entire year was just that one state. And so then I went through Alabama, which there's a road walk that connects to a smaller trail. And then, so it's another 200 miles of road walking to get to another little trail called the Pinhoti Trail. And then that finally got me to the Appalachian Trail. So it was March before I got up to the Appalachian Trail proper. So the extension of that route is called the Eastern Continental Trail. And I heard about that from a guy named Jupiter that does a lot of long distance hiking that's here. I just heard about it on YouTube, and that's what kind of interested me. And part of what inspired me to put together the route that I did was hearing about this, that you can go from the southernmost point all the way up into Canada and then on into Canada, actually. But I of course, stopped at the border. So anyways, got through Alabama. There was road walking, and then that's where I started to feel kind of close to home again. I was born in Alabama and grew up in Tennessee, just north of there. And so I was kind of in my home region. I'm starting to see friends and family, close friends and family, not, just kind of the distant relatives and everybody, but felt like I was in familiar territory. Started to see billboards advertising like law firms I was familiar with and that kind of stuff. And then got on up to Georgia and got onto the Appalachian Trail and got to register my hike. They have a little registration tag you put on your pack. And so went from being the Florida Trail is gaining in popularity. I think there were maybe 50 people or so that set out within a week to try to hike that trail together last year. So they used to have maybe 5 or 10 in a year. So that one's growing. But on the Appalachian Trail, the first night I was on trail, there were 50 people at the first shelter. And so going from, being alone, people asking what I'm doing on the side of the road, to getting to a trail where everybody knows what you're doing and tons of people are out. I think March 1st is maybe the most popular date to start that trail. And so I got to the shelter and went from, being totally alone to being totally surrounded by people. And that was great. So then after Georgia, you get up into Tennessee and North Carolina. The trail goes through the Smokies, which is my backyard. That's what I grew up in. I went to college just on the west, or grew up on just the west side in Tennessee, and then went to college on the east side in North Carolina. So that area felt like home and very familiar. And that's about 300 miles. It's just kind of walking the mountain ridge that is the border between those two states for a while. And you've got, of course, Smokies, which is the most visited national park here in the U.S. And that's also where one of the highest density of bears in the country. And so started seeing bears fairly regularly, not too much. But even the Smokies, the trail only goes through about 70 miles. For the most part, it's other kind of land areas. So again, that was like the most homey feeling of the entire year. It's going through that section. So that felt great. And after 2 months, I've been looking forward to that so much, of just getting onto a familiar trail and being in familiar territory. And then across into Virginia, which is the longest state on the Appalachian Trail, which is about 500 miles. But having done Florida, that didn't feel too crazy long. And then I'd gotten fortunate and hit kind of a good spring window coming through the first little bit. So things were fairly warm for the most part. I was in shorts and, thin shirt for during the days, and was really comfortable, but started getting some snow coming through Virginia. One of the toughest parts of the southern bit, at least, is the Smokies. So after getting through the Smokies, Virginia is a little bit easier to hike through. You got Shenandoah National Park, and that's really well visited, and that's got a lot of big roads that you drive through on. So you're walking next to roads on ridges a lot through that area. And a lot of my family also lives in Virginia, and so that was kind of the northern end of my sort of home bubble that I was hiking through. And then you get into all the really short states. So West Virginia is about 9 miles. That's the center point of the Appalachian Trail, and so the Conservancy Center's there. So you can register and kind of do a check-in point there. And so when I started out, I was the 706th person to register as a thru hiker on the Appalachian Trail. So I registered at the beginning, and then by the time I got to the middle point, I was the 13th person to make it to that point. At least it registered, and they were closed a lot during the week. They were still figuring things out, kind of post-COVID. So there were a lot more people than that had come through, but still, I passed quite a few people at that point. And then you've got, West Virginia is 9 miles. Maryland is about 40. And so it's a bunch of just short states. But you're through that kind of region through the Northeast. So Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, all those states are a lot kind of closer to little communities and roads. And so going through New England, you can do what people call deli blazing or deli hopping, where you can get like a sandwich from a gas station like 2 or 3 times a day if you want to, as you're like coming really close with all these places. So that was nice. I mentioned in the last episode that you cross roads about every 5 miles. A lot of those are back roads that like you could get to if you had to, but in this area, you're actually going by like fairly populated roads a lot of the time, which takes away from the nature experience a bit, but also gives you access to fresh sandwiches all day, every day. So it's pretty nice too.
Yeah, that was one thing that I was going to bring up. Do you think it? I don't know whether "takes away" is the right word, but it's sort of like it takes away from the sort of magic of hiking, because like when I and a lot of people think of hiking, it is in the wilderness. That's the sort of the point of hiking. You're getting out in nature and different scenery, and it's picturesque. You're not walking through. You're not going to, I would call it a petrol station, you call it a gas station. Like, you're not going to gas stations, stuff like that. Do you think that takes away from it? Or like you said, because you have them little, especially on the distances you're doing, do you feel that them little sort of perks of home, and like you say, you're not having to carry a lot of equipment, like food
Mhm.
wise, food and drink, because you know where your next stop is, and it's not too far. Do you think that sort of helps with it?
I think from folks that I've talked to, other hikers, it depends on the person. For me, it's a perfect balance. I love it. The Appalachian Trail has the most access to that sort of stuff, but then it's also nicknamed the Green Tunnel because there's so much foliage over it that you're really in a tunnel a lot of the time. So even when you're kind of near towns, sometimes you're not just um, having these huge open views. You're in this tunnel, so you really feel like you're in the woods, even when you're kind of close to the town. And I love that. That's what I grew up in. That's what feels like home to me. And it's on a smaller scale and a bigger scale. That was one of the best things that helped me throughout the year last year, is having things to look forward to in the short term. And so, it's a wet stretch for a couple days, but I know, like, all right, tomorrow I'm going to be going into a hostel. I can take a shower. It's going to be great. Or even waking up in the morning, like there's a gas station like 10 miles in, so I'm going to be able to get breakfast. So having those little kind of highlights to look forward to was huge for me, for just having like motivation and something to look forward to all the time. And it varies by trail. So on like the other two trails that are out west, there are like multi-100-mile stretches where you don't have any access to anything. And so there are some huge wilderness areas. On the Appalachian Trail, the biggest one's called the 100-mile Wilderness. That's in Maine. So there's pockets here and there of bigger wilderness areas. But once I got into it and kind of knew what to expect, I grew to love that. And having it takes away from it feeling like a wilderness experience, but it also gives you the opportunity to be connected to the communities a little bit more, and makes it feel more like kind of like just general travel and sightseeing, of getting to go into these small towns and see people and everything. And so it keeps it from being fully wilderness, but I think there's still a balance there that I really love, being able to get out and camp and, not see any city lights. And then the next day be able to walk into a place, and get hot, fresh food and be around people and just kind of feel like you're a little bit of a part of society again.
Yeah, definitely. I was going to ask as well. Obviously, you said about having things to look forward to. When you first set out, obviously with the mammoth task of was it 11,000 miles?
Yeah, that was the initial goal.
So when you're looking at that as 11,000 miles, did you just look at that as just one big chunk, or were you breaking it down and like, right, I'm going to get this done, setting yourself sort of markers at each point, like, or did I suppose you could have just used the state lines?
Yeah, right. So, mentally, the state lines do help a lot, as far as like feeling like you've accomplished something, even though they don't mean too much. Except, that maybe sales tax is going to be different for the next few days.
Right.
But
Yeah,
even in planning it,
that's mad about America, how weird all your taxes and stuff are. It's insane.
It's just as weird to me, for what it's worth. But yeah, so I'm a big planner. So on the trail, everybody kind of goes by a trail name or a nickname. I forgot to mention this last time, but my trail name's Professor because of my attention to detail and planning and logistics and everything. So with all of the long hikes that I've ever done, I've gone through and mapped out every single day before I've done it. And so last year I had gone through in January of 2021, and I went through my maps and mapped out where I thought I was going to be every day for the entire year. And I never planned on sticking to that, and I didn't. That was out the window on day one. But I like the mental exercise of going through that, both so that I know, because it really, you're doing like a 3 to 5 day trip at a time. So as long as you can get to the next town, you're going to be fine. So that's really all that you ever have to plan for the most part. So knowing that in advance, it helped to kind of like practice planning for each of those little pockets, and knowing kind of when there's going to be some longer stretches and shorter stretches, and having a rough estimate of when I was going to be places to be able to tell people to mark their calendars to be able to see me. And that gave me the chance to know when I was going to look forward to what things, of like, oh yeah, great. So in the first weekend in March, my family's going to come and get this cabin in Georgia right before I start the Appalachian Trail. So like little things like that I had that I was looking forward to for the entire year. So yeah, so I totally did that ahead of time, and that helped a lot with the excitement of not thinking of like, all right, it's day 2. I've only got 10,970 miles to go, but thinking like, all right, it's day 2. I've got 30 miles to today's hotel. I can do that. So that helped a lot. It's just mentally kind of blocking it off.
And with that, during the whole time, did you sustain any injuries at all?
Yeah. So I had, of course, my body's beat up. So just a little wear and tear of not like a I can't hike injury, but just like, man, it hurts to hike injury. So when I got to Virginia, so by the end of March, the transition of doing big mile days, so 25, 30 mile days on flat roads straight into mountains, really was tearing up my Achilles tendons. And so I had Achilles tendonitis basically from the end of March all the way until December that I was managing. So there's a lot of pain management that I was dealing with. The only time that I ever actually like got hurt and had to sit out was in late August on the Continental Divide Trail. And it was, it was one of those injuries that feels dumb when you do it. I was on the trail. I was heading into the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which is the largest wilderness area in the lower 48. The only thing bigger is in Alaska. And I had a 150-mile stretch, and I had 4 days of food, so I needed to do about 40-mile days to get through it. And about 3 miles in, I came across a group that was being led by a guy on horseback. So there's a group of all these folks on horses that are coming through. And I stepped off into the brush and was looking up, talking to them. They were really nice. I had my trekking poles in one hand, and I was eating a candy bar in the other hand. And I was just looking up, talking to them, not really looking at my footing, still trying to move while they're passing by, and just tripped and fell and reached out and landed on my hand. I scuffed a big chunk of skin off of my hand, and more than anything, just kind of felt dumb in the process. And I popped back up and felt okay, just kind of mad at myself. I bandaged it up and started walking, and then realized that my hip was what the real problem was. And so I landed on a rock on my hip. So with a fully loaded backpack, you fall a lot faster than you're used to ever falling. So I went down really quick and didn't really have a ton of time to stop myself. So I caught myself a bit on my hand, mostly on my hip. And I was moving really slow and needed to move really fast. I had 72 hours basically at that point to go almost 150 miles. So I needed to really cook, and I was going slow. But I had cell phone service right there. And so I called the hostel I just left, and they met me back at the trailhead. So I turned around and hiked 3 miles to go out. I took 2.5 days off and then got back on trail and was totally fine. But up until that point, like from the time throughout the majority of the Appalachian Trail, I took very few days off. I had a break where I went to go to Trail Days, which is this big trail party. I took 5 days off to get to go do that, just to take a little break in the middle. But other than that, I think I took maybe 4 days off throughout the first 5 months. And so taking off a couple days in a row definitely slowed me down a bit. I went 70 days without taking a day off to get started. And so my days off were really limited through the year. I knew I was going to have to take some in some places, but even 2.5 days off was like a pretty big chunk to take, especially at that point when I'm racing the cold weather that's coming through. But I think all in all, I was still pretty fortunate. I mean, even just being able to stay out until December, nothing was so extreme that it really took me off trail. So I got a little bit injured, but definitely not more than I expected.
Yeah. Right. I've jumped in there, obviously, and butted in. Do you want to carry on, obviously, where we got to?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So, so in New England, going through the states, they kind of run together. Pennsylvania is notorious for being really rocky. The elevation is relatively low. It's not a ton of huge ups and downs, but just the perfect size rocks. Like I've heard them called like baby's head rocks. That's about the size that they are, to where like you can't fully balance on them, but you can't step to the side of them. The whole trail is just rocks. And so about half the state, about 100 miles is that way. And so that just really wears and tears on your feet.
Wow.
And then after Pennsylvania, getting up to New Jersey, New York, you can actually see the skyline in New York City from the trail. You're about 30 something miles away, but there's a few points where you can look off into the distance. And that was the first time I'd ever seen the New York City skyline, was from the Appalachian Trail the first time that I hiked it. And so that's pretty cool. And again, something too, where like it detracts a little bit from feeling like you're in the wilderness, but also like in the middle of your hiking day, looking up and seeing like, oh, that's New York City. That's pretty cool. Those sorts of things are neat. So then after those states, getting up into Vermont and New Hampshire, and that's where the trail gets tough. And that physically, that was the hardest part of the entire year. Was getting into New Hampshire and then Maine. So Vermont's gorgeous. It was just starting to get kind of into muddy season with the snow melt. I ran into like icy snow for the first time where I'm post holing and my feet are sinking through the snow and tearing up my shins a little bit. So just maybe one mountain peak throughout all of Vermont had that. And I had a buddy that was with me at the time. But then getting into New Hampshire, the White Mountain Range is just really extreme, really steep hiking where you're really scrambling. Like you need your hands a lot of the time to be able to pull yourself up these rock faces basically with your backpack on. So it gets pretty ridiculous to even call it hiking through some of that. It's really intense. They've got like ladders that are built into it in places. Some places you just have to pull yourself up with tree roots. And then going that far north and getting into kind of higher elevations again, there's a lot of lingering snow. So I needed my micro spikes at that point because you just got some steep icy faces that you're coming across in some of the rocks. So that got pretty sketchy. My longest hiking day of the year was in New Hampshire. So the farthest hiking day was 45 miles, but the longest that I hiked was a day in New Hampshire where I covered, I was hiking for about 19 hours and covered just over 20 miles. I could just barely go a mile an hour because everything was so steep and icy and I had to go so slow. And this is without taking any breaks also. So going nonstop, the terrain is just so extreme that I was just going at a snail's pace for the majority of the day. So came out of New Hampshire and then got into Maine, and it's still pretty difficult going through Maine as you transition into like the 100-mile wilderness where things, the very northern end, things kind of start to get a little bit more manageable and not as crazy steep. But Maine's beautiful. That's finally after getting through the Northeast and kind of what you picture with New England and cozy little towns. In Maine, you get back into just really big wilderness areas, and that's the last state before getting up into Canada as well. And so in Maine, you get to Mount Katahdin, which is the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. Had a gorgeous day up there. I hiked through clouds all day and a little bit of hail. Got up to the top, and there was exactly a 15-minute window while I was up there where the clouds totally cleared and I had blue skies for pictures. And then the clouds moved back in and it started to snow on me again. And then after that, to get to the Canadian border, so that's the end of the Appalachian Trail. But for me to extend and go border to border, it was only about another 80 miles after I finished that to go up and tag the border and then finish up. So that finished leg one. I was moving at a slower pace than I needed to. So I was averaging about 23 miles through that point in the year. But also knowing that the Appalachian Trail is physically the most difficult of the three. Based on experience, I knew it was harder than Pacific Crest Trail and had heard that it was similar to the Continental Divide. So I had moved slower than I wanted, but had kind of expected that. And then my knees were just so beat up from all the steep downs as much as anything that I took 10 days off and spent time with my family in Alabama before heading back out west. And then jumped on the Pacific Crest Trail. And like I mentioned in the last podcast, I initially hopped over and skipped the first 700 miles, which is the desert section of the Pacific Crest Trail. So I jumped right into the Sierra Nevada, kind of in central California, and went through the Sierras, which is fantastic. That was the longest wilderness stretch for me. So that was about 200 miles without any kind of road access or anything, without taking like a long side trail. There's a few chances where you can take like a 7 or 8 mile side trail to go one direction to get to a remote trailhead and then hope to hitch into a town. But as far as getting to like the next actual road crossing on the trail, it was a 200-mile stretch. So took 10 days off and then hopped back on trail where I didn't know anybody on the trail. I had 7 days of food and a 2.5-pound bear canister in my pack. So my pack's the heaviest it's been all year. I'm not going to have cell service for a week. So that was one of the hardest parts of the entire experience, was getting started after all that rest and getting back into there. But that mountain range is just so fantastic that it was pretty quick to get back into the groove of hiking as soon as I got back into it out there.
So when you're going out for, and you've got your 7 days of kit and all the rest of it, how much weight would you say you're carrying there?
Yeah, so my pack weight through the years of backpacking and getting into the nitty gritty of the gear, I've I've got a kit that's just that's quite small. So my base weight, which is my weight before food and water and everything, just the gear alone, throughout the year was somewhere between about 9 and 12 pounds. And it's about 2 kilograms a pound, so that's 18. No,
the other way.
No, the other way. Yeah, so like 4 or 5 kilograms. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then on top of that, so then with food and water and everything, I was probably about 35 or 40 pounds fully loaded up when it was the heaviest all year. So 18, 20 kilograms.
Yeah.
And usually, so for the most part, definitely on the Appalachian Trail, water's so abundant that I never really had to carry much more than a liter of water at the time. So that's really helpful. And then there's some deserty sections on the Pacific Crest on the other two, where you have to kind of have some longer water carries. But the trail community is great, and there's water caches that are pretty abundant. And so a lot of the dry stretches where you might have had to carry, or between natural water sources, you might have 40 or 50 miles, but they're set up to be just like big multi-gallon jugs of water that are placed. So it was rare. The longest water carry I had was maybe about 20 miles for the entire year. But in the Sierras, you're up in the mountains, you're up with snow melt, and there's water all over the place. So I didn't have to carry too much water, at least during that section where my pack was its heaviest.
When you're trekking with the poles, as you said, you wore a pair out. How often are you using your poles? Were they constantly in use?
Yeah, so I found I used them whenever I felt like I needed a little bit more stability and support. And so on the Appalachian Trail, that was probably 90% of the time I was like actively using both of them. And then the other 10%, it was maybe cruisy enough. I could just carry them in one hand, and then I'd usually be snacking with my other hand when I could. And so I got used to, if I don't need my poles, I'm not going to use them. But then that number just about reversed on the other side. So when I got to the other trails, so like the Pacific Crest Trail and a good portion of the Continental Divide are graded for pack animal travel. And so you can hike the entire Pacific Crest Trail with a pack animal. So it's rare that people do it, but you could essentially ride a horse or bring some mules the entire way. And so the grade is really gentle. And so I found it was maybe like 20 or 30% of the time I'm using my poles once I got out west. And the rest of the time, I'm carrying them and pull them out when there's a little sketchy section. But a lot of it, I'm just able to walk without the use of extra support, with that really nice grade out west, at least.
Yeah. I'm only asking, obviously, for me, in June.
Right.
Yeah. I said I wasn't going to, but I think I probably will, because I've heard from a few different people now that it does make a hell of a difference.
Yeah, and I never used them before in hiking until I got into long distance hiking. I thought they looked kind of silly and pointless, and like, oh, it's just walking. Like, what do you need that for? But then actually getting out and doing, some bigger miles and going on trickier terrain, the little extra stability went a long way. And now I can't go out without them. Even for shorter hikes, just being out for the day, I still feel like they're helpful to be able to, not have to really slow down and use your hands and everything when you get to something that might be a little bit steep, but just to kind of keep your flow going, to have some more support. I think they're super helpful.
When you were saying about when you're getting onto the second trail, I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah, the Pacific Crest.
The Pacific Crest. When you're on that, like, how often are you seeing people throughout the whole thing, I suppose? Like, although you're, when you're stopping up at the hostels and stuff like that, but day to day, during the day, are you seeing many people? Obviously, you're going past them or whatever, or like, how many people do you sort of see?
Yeah, great question. So, like on the Appalachian Trail, well, throughout the year, it's pretty common and becoming more and more popular for people to set out to do a through hike of these trails. And on the Appalachian Trail, or for a lot of the year, I'm hiking in the non-ideal seasons to be out there. So, for most of the Appalachian Trail, it was not the season to be there. I was the fourth person to finish the trail last year, so way ahead of most people that are out there. But with that, there's still great access for like just weekend trips for people to go out and just day hikers. So on the Appalachian Trail, even going in like the not popular season, there wasn't a single day where I didn't see at least a handful of people, whether just out for the day, parked at a trailhead that I'd go by, or people out for a weekend, Boy Scout groups or what have you. And then on the Pacific Crest Trail, I was out there in the prime hiking season. And so I went from the Appalachian Trail where I was seeing some folks daily, but still it was really easy to find camp spots. But on the Pacific Crest Trail, I got out there, and being in the prime spot in the prime season, it was hard to find places to camp at night. It doesn't have as good of an infrastructure as the Appalachian Trail does, with as many. It doesn't have any shelters like the AT does. There's just like good worn camp spots. But I'm hiking into the night usually to be able to get the miles that I needed to. And I was often getting to camp spots, and they're just totally full of I don't know, 15, 20, 30 people packed into these small areas. So throughout the day, constantly, there's tons of people that were out in kind of that heart. So, from June to August, that's the best time to be on these trails. So between through hikers and then also people just out for their summer vacations. Tons of people for the most part. It wasn't until I got to the Continental Divide Trail and was kind of later in the season, everyone that was hiking south that year was well ahead of me. I'm just way back at the tail end. It's starting to get cold out, so people don't really want to be out for fun. But even then, for 80% of the time, I saw at least one person during the day. So it was rare that I wouldn't see a single soul, but it did happen some. But yeah, for most of the year, I'm seeing people at least saying, "Hey, how are you?" a handful of times during the day.
All right, nice. So it's not like you're just isolated on your own out there,
right?
Do you want to carry on the story? I keep jumping in.
Yeah, it's great. It probably helps to break it up a little bit of just kind of this long narrative of I hiked here, I hiked here, I hiked here.
Yeah.
So anyway, so California is 1,700 miles. It's by far the longest state. But I broke it up. So Florida was 1,200, California was 1,700. But I started 700 miles into California. So I hiked 1,000 miles in California. So that's a long state. And after I got through the Sierras, I had a hiking partner for a little while, and I had one on the Appalachian Trail as well, of just people that were doing similar paces that I was doing. So I actually had some companionship for a little bit out there, which was awesome. And then I slowed down just a little bit. My dad was on sabbatical last summer, and so he spent about a month with the rest of the family, my mom and my sister and her fiance, traveling around Europe. And then he and my uncle rented an RV and a car for 2 weeks and followed me around Northern California. So every day I mapped it out so I'd get to a road crossing, and then I had a place to stay. They ended up they found RV parks that were nearby. So they'd pick me up in a car and take me back, and we'd have this elaborate camp system set up. They were cooking dinner. There's a big bathhouse to shower every day. So I got pretty spoiled in Northern California and got to spend 2 full weeks seeing my dad and my uncle every single day. So that was another thing that I was looking forward to all year. They bought their plane tickets and rented the RV like in January for this event that was happening in July. But that was also one of the biggest pressures I had on myself, that they had paid for these tickets and had this reservation to like, all right, I got to keep going. I got a date to make so that I can meet them at this certain place. And of course, skipping the desert helped with that, to be able to get ahead a little bit to right around where they were going to be. So they flew in and met me near Lake Tahoe. So they flew into Reno, Nevada, which is right near Vegas. They flew got an RV and everything, and then drove. They were within just a couple hours of where I was on trail. And then I just kind of hopped and got to see them for most of the northern bit of California there, which is really nice. And so then after that, getting into Oregon is the next state. And so that's probably the easiest terrain of the entire year. Notoriously, that's just one of the easiest states. It's by a lot of lakes. It kind of flattens out a little bit. And I got there in mosquito season. So the snow had just melted. The snow had kind of lingered a bit later than it normally does. And so that meant that the mosquitoes were hatching and were out like crazy. And this was normally just kind of in the beginning and ends of the days. So the first hour or two of the day, mosquitoes are terrible. And then at the end of the day as well. So putting on pants and stuff to hike in the heat of the day, had a bug net over my face, but still just swatting them off nonstop because they got pretty intense. But I was able to push kind of some bigger miles there and got to kind of experiment with how far I could go. And I was doing 30, 35 miles a day for the most part. The terrain was a lot easier to hike than it had been out east on the Appalachian Trail. And so I was getting to where I had a stretch, my biggest mileage stretch. I did 40 miles a day for 5 days and was able to cover 200 miles in 5 days.
Wow.
And so I kind of looked at it was to make up for lost time. I was trying to average 33 miles a day. And so I could hike 33 miles over 6 days to get to 200 miles. Or I could hike 40 miles a day for 5 days and then earn a day off. And so I started kind of experimenting with it with that way of just kind of playing around with different ways to break it down. And I was slowed down a bit from my Achilles tendonitis that I had been dealing with for a while. So people were hiking by me throughout the day. I was pulling over to let people pass. But then I was hiking, 3-4 hours after they'd already set their tent up. So I'd pass them in the night and then never see folks again. So I wasn't moving the fastest by all means, but I was putting in the hours and starting to hike like consistently 16, 17 hours a day. Just about nonstop to get to camp and set up and reset the next day. So Oregon's where I started putting in really big miles. And then Washington gets more difficult again, getting into kind of the steep Cascades a bit. But that was my favorite state. So I loved the terrain. I found a new hiking partner that I was with for a couple of weeks there. And she had, some folks are photographers and carry their really nice cameras. And she was one of those people. So I have fantastic photos from my time in Washington. I had a personal photographer right behind me the whole way. So I have great pictures from my favorite section of the trail up there. So I started the Pacific Crest Trail on June 18th and then got up to the Canadian border on August 18th. So it was about 60 days to do the northern 2,000 miles or so. And that was the stretch where I was able to average overall the biggest mileage throughout the entire year.
All right. 40 miles a day, especially back to back 5 days. That's some serious going. That is. Unfortunately, it brings us to the end of second episode. So, would you like to give everyone your socials?
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I can't remember if I said it in this episode or the previous episode. But I logged pretty well everything that I did every day for the entire year through my Instagram channel. And so usually like 3 to 5 days worth of information in a journal entry with about 10 pictures. So all that's there, for folks to go back through and read about any of this or check out any of those sections. And so I've only got Instagram right now, and it's prof_Carl. So my trail name and my real name. So PROF_CARL is where I am on Instagram, and that's where all my stuff is from the past and all my future hikes as well, of course.
Okay, brilliant. Are you going to stick around for a third episode?
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
And we can get it all locked in. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast, Carl. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and thank you for listening, everybody.
Yeah, cheers.